Welcome to Developing Graphics Frameworks with Python and OpenGL, Part 2, the Graphics Pipeline. In this video, you'll learn about the different stages that a GPU goes through when rendering three-dimensional scenes. A graphics pipeline is an abstract model that describes a sequence of steps that's needed to render a three-dimensional scene. Pipelining allows a task to be split into subtasks, each of which can be worked on in parallel, similar to an assembly line for manufacturing products in a factory, which increases overall efficiency. Graphics pipelines increase the efficiency of the rendering process, enabling images to be displayed at faster rates. Multiple pipeline models are possible. The one described here is commonly used for rendering real-time graphics using OpenGL, which consists of the following four stages: the application stage, the geometry processing stage, the rasterization stage, and the pixel processing stage. In the application stage, that consists of initializing the window where the graphics are displayed and sending data to the GPU, and we'll talk about this and all the other stages in much more detail later. There's the geometry processing stage, in which is responsible for determining the position of each vertex of the geometric shapes being rendered, and that's implemented by a program called a vertex shader, which you'll learn a lot about. There's the rasterization stage, in which it's determined which pixels correspond to the different shapes being rendered. And there's the pixel processing stage, which determines the color of each pixel in the rendered image. And that involves another program you'll learn a lot about called fragment shaders. Now, in the application stage primarily involves processes that run on the CPU. The first task, which might come to your mind, would be to create the window where the rendered graphics will be displayed. And when you're working with OpenGL, this can be accomplished using a variety of programming languages. Here, we'll use Python. The window, or a canvas-like object within the window, must be initialized so that graphics are read from the GPU frame buffer. And in the case of animated or interactive applications, the main application will contain a loop that re-renders the scene repeatedly, typically aiming for a rate of 60 frames per second. Other processes that might be handled by the CPU could include monitoring hardware for user input events with a keyboard or a mouse, or running algorithms for other tasks, like simulating physics or performing collision detection. Another class of tasks performed by the application includes reading data required for the rendering process and sending that data to the GPU. Some of this data could include vertex attributes, which describe the appearance of the shapes being rendered, image data, which could be applied to surfaces, and the source code for the vertex shader and fragment shader programs, which will be used later on during the graphics pipeline. OpenGL describes the functions that are used to transmit the data to the GPU, and those functions are accessed through the bindings of the programming language that's used to write the application. Now, the data which defines the appearance of the vertices, vertex attribute data, is stored in vertex buffer objects, or VBOs. Image data that's used for textures will be stored in texture buffers. And it's important to note that when this data is sent to the GPU, it's not automatically assigned to any particular program variables. Those associations will be specified later. And finally, source code for the vertex shader and fragment shaders, that needs to be sent to the GPU and then compiled and loaded to be used. During the application stage, you'll also specify the associations between the attribute data, which is stored in the vertex buffer objects, and the attribute variables in the vertex shader program. And those associations between those two components, those are managed using vertex array objects, or VAOs. And they can be activated and deactivated as needed if you're drawing lots of different geometric shapes. So once the necessary data has been sent to the GPU, before the rendering takes place, the application needs to specify these associations. Now, a single geometric shape might have multiple attributes for each vertex. There's the position of each vertex, but each vertex might have a different color. So you might need to work with multiple buffer objects. And again, these will all be managed by vertex array objects. The next stage is geometry processing. In computer graphics, the shape of a geometric object is defined by a mesh, which is a collection of points that are grouped typically into lines or triangles, as shown here. We have a wireframe representing a spherical mesh and a wireframe representing a teapot mesh. And in addition to the overall shape of an object, there may be additional information required for each vertex that describe how an object should be rendered. And these properties or attributes that are specific to rendering each individual point are grouped together into a data structure called a vertex. A vertex must contain a three-dimensional position of the corresponding point, but it may also contain additional data, such as different colors to be used when rendering each point. It could include texture coordinates, also known as UV coordinates, which indicate which points within a texture should be applied to which points within the geometric model. Also, there are normal vector attributes, and that specifies the direction perpendicular to a surface, and that's used a lot in lighting calculations. And here in this diagram, we have 4 different spheres, each of which is rendered using different sets of attributes. On the left, we have a wireframe mesh for a sphere, which only requires positions. Here, in second position, we have a blue sphere. A solid color has been applied, but normal vectors are also used to do shading calculations. You'll notice the sphere is brighter in the top right corner and darker along this edge. That's calculated using normal vectors. The third sphere also has the shading effect applied, but has vertex colors. So each vertex is rendered using a different color, and those colors are blended throughout each triangle. And finally, on the last sphere, once again we have shading with normal vectors, but an image has been applied to the surface. And the points on the image, which correspond to each point on a sphere, and those are specified using texture coordinates, which we'll learn much about later on. Now, during the geometry processing stage, a program called the vertex shader is applied to each of the vertices. Each variable in the vertex shader will receive data from one of these buffers that you sent data to during the application stage, and which variable receives data from which buffer, that's determined by the previously specified associations, which are stored in a vertex array object. The primary purpose of the vertex shader program is to determine the final position of each point being rendered, which is typically calculated from a series of 3 transformations. First, the collection of points that determine the intrinsic shape of an object. They might be translated or rotated or scaled so that the object appears to occupy a particular location and orientation and size with respect to a virtual 3-dimensional world. This process is called the model transformation, and coordinates that are expressed from this frame of reference are said to be in world space. In addition, there may be a virtual camera with its own position and orientation in the virtual world. And so if you want to render the world from this camera's point of view, the coordinates of each object must be converted to a frame of reference relative to the camera itself. And this process is called the view transformation. Coordinates expressed from this frame of reference are said to be in view space, or camera space, or eye space. Finally, the set of points in the world that are considered to be visible usually occupy a box-shaped or a frustum-shaped region. They have to be scaled to and aligned with the space which is rendered by OpenGL. OpenGL renders a set of points in a cube-shaped region whose coordinates are between -1 and +1. And the position of each point in the vertex shader is assumed to be within this frame of reference. And this is accomplished with a projection transformation. Any points outside this cubical region are automatically discarded or clipped from the scene, and coordinates expressed at this stage are said to be in clip space. And more specifically, when performing the projection transformation, you might use an orthographic projection or a perspective projection, depending on whether the visible world shape is within a box or within a frustum. A perspective projection is usually used. That's illustrated here on the right. A perspective projection is generally considered to produce more realistic images because objects which are farther away from the virtual camera are considered or appear smaller when they're rendered. On the left here we have an orthographic projection, and the cubes which are further away from the virtual camera, the edge lengths appear to be the same length no matter how far away they are. So those are the three types of projections you might encounter when doing geometry processing stage. After geometry processing comes rasterization. Once the final positions of each vertex have been specified by the vertex shader, the rasterization stage begins. The points themselves first have to be grouped into some kind of geometric primitive, and that can be points, lines, or triangles. In other words, sets of 1, 2, or 3 points. 2 points determine a line segment, 3 points determine a triangle. And in the case of lines or triangles, additional information must be specified. So for example, consider a set of, say, 6 points which you want to render as a line. Do you want to just pair off the first 2 points for one line segment, and then the next 2 points for a line segment, or the final 2 points for a line segment, to have disjoint segments, or do you want a connected set of segments? All these are things which must be specified and are taken into account during the rasterization stage. The process of grouping these points into geometric primitives is called primitive assembly. And after grouping the sets of points, the next step is to determine which pixels correspond to the interior of each geometric primitive shape. Since pixels are discrete units, they can really only approximate the continuous nature of a geometric shape. And some criterion has to be used to clarify which pixels count as being in the interior. So here are 3 possible criteria you could use. For example, the entire pixel is contained within the shape. And we have 3 images down here which illustrate each of these criteria. In each case, you have a continuous blue triangle. Applying this first criterion, the entire pixel area is contained within the shape, would result in these shaded pixels being displayed to represent that triangle. Second criterion, the center point of the pixel is contained within the shape. That would create this second rasterization of the triangle. The third criterion, any part of the pixel is contained within the shape, would result in this third image. And for each pixel corresponding to the interior of a shape, something called a fragment is created. A fragment is a collection of data used to determine the color of a single pixel in a rendered image. The data stored in a fragment always includes the raster position, also called pixel coordinates. And when rendering a three-dimensional scene, fragments also store a depth value, which is needed to determine which points are closer to the virtual camera. Additional data could be assigned to each vertex, such as a color, and this data can be passed along from the vertex shader to the fragment shader. And in this case, a new field would be added to a fragment, in this case a color field. And the value assigned to this field at each interior point is interpolated from the values at the vertices. Interpolated means calculated with a weighted average. So for an example, here we have a triangle, and in addition to each vertex occupying a certain position, each vertex was assigned a color. This vertex was assigned red, this one assigned green, and this one assigned blue. For each interior point of this triangle, a color must be assigned that's going to be calculated based on these three colors. So fragments whose pixels are closest to the red vertex, they'll appear a little bit more red. Those which appear closest to the green vertex will appear a little bit more green. Those closest to the blue vertex will appear a little bit more blue. Now, during the pixel processing stage, which appears after the rasterization stage, the primary goal is to determine the final color of each pixel. And then this data will be stored within the color buffer, which sits within the frame buffer. During the first part of the pixel processing stage, a program called the fragment shader will be applied to each of the fragments to calculate their final color. And this calculation could involve a variety of data stored in each fragment, in combination with some globally available data, such as maybe there's a base color applied to the shape. There could be colors stored in each fragment, as we just saw, interpolated from vertex colors. There might be a texture or an image applied to the surface of the shape, as shown in this picture here. On the left, we have an image, and on the right, we have a cube that the image is being applied to. And so texture coordinates at this stage in the graphics pipeline would say which points in this image should be applied to which points on the surface of the cube. Finally, the fragment shader might take into account light sources whose relative position or orientation could cause the colors to lighten or darken depending on the direction the surface is facing. So again, looking at this cube as an example, you might see that you might imagine there's a light source kind of up here in this location in the 3D scene, causing the top side of the cube to appear brightest, the front side to be second brightest, and then this left side, which is furthest away from our virtual light source, to be darkest. All of those calculations occur in the pixel processing stage. And that happens specifically within the fragment shader code. There are some parts during pixel processing which are automatically handled. One of those calculations involves depth. The depth values stored in each fragment are used to resolve visibility issues in a three-dimensional scene. They help you determine which parts are blocked from view by other objects. So after the color of a fragment has been calculated, the fragment's depth value is compared to whatever value is currently stored in the depth buffer, the corresponding pixel. If the current fragment's depth value is smaller than the stored buffer value, then that fragment must be closer to the camera, and its color will overwrite the data currently stored in the color buffer. If a fragment's depth value is larger than the value stored in the depth buffer, then that fragment or that pixel must be further away from the virtual camera, and then that data would be discarded at that point. All of that's automatically handled by the GPU. Another feature handled at this stage automatically by the GPU is transparency, and this uses the alpha values stored in each fragment to determine how much of one color should be blended with another color. However, pixel processing working with transparency is subtly difficult, and so you have to be very careful. The transparency calculations occur at the same time the depth values are being resolved. In any scene involving transparent objects must render the opaque objects first, followed by the transparent objects. The opaque objects can be rendered in any order, but the transparent objects must be rendered starting from the farthest from the camera all the way to the closest to the camera. And if you don't follow this particular order, transparency effects could fail. So, for example, imagine in this picture if the transparent blue sphere had been rendered first. And then assume that maybe this triangulated sphere behind it was rendered second. Right, checking the depth value at the vertices of this sphere, well, their depth values will be greater than the depth values on this blue transparent sphere. That means the colors on this sphere would be discarded. Right? And you wouldn't see this version, this part of the sphere behind the blue transparent sphere. In this scene, you would have to render these two opaque spheres first, and then this transparent sphere last. Right? And it's really useful to understand how the GPU works, because understanding that will enable you to render more complex three-dimensional scenes. All right, so that's going to be it for some of the core concepts and vocabulary we're going to need before we start programming. The next step is going to be to set up your development environment. So we'll talk about that next.